Hey friends, welcome back. So when it comes to scientifically explaining the rapid increase in overweight and obesity throughout the world, and particularly here in the US, there's two different models. The sort of classical energy balance model, okay, and we're going to talk about the leading scientist, Kevin Hall, and various proponents of this model, the pluses and minuses, and I think shortcomings of that model. Then the other model to explain this rapid increase in obesity throughout the world, and namely here in the US as well, is the carbohydrate insulin model of obesity. And this has been sort of, the tenets of this model have been characterized and well characterized by David Ludwig, Walter Willett, Jeff Volek, and other scientists. And so what we're going to do today is talk about some recent articles that I think you should be putting on your radar, and you might want to possibly refer to the show notes throughout this video, because we're going to talk about this image right here from this paper titled The Carbohydrate Insulin Model, a Physiologic Perspective on the Obesity Pandemic. Now, I think it's important, and what I'm going to do throughout this video and this podcast is I would like to be objective as possible. Now, it's impossible to be totally objective because we all have our biases. And as many of you know, I got into this whole field by, sort of this paleo diet that I discovered by happenstance, really, when I was in college cycling and reading Lauren Cordain's work back in 2005. I was influenced by my stepmother, who was into the Atkins diet in the late 90s. So I'm biased, but I would like to present this as objective as possible. So you've sort of heard about these different models. You know about the energy balance model, and even major textbooks now that many physicians reference and read. Essentially, I'm going to read you a quote here. All diets result in weight loss, and they do so on one and only one basis, and that is they reduce total calorie intake. And so that's sort of the premise, the tenet of the energy balance model of obesity. So it's basically, if you eat more than you expend, you're going to gain weight. And the inverse is true. If you eat less than you expend, you will lose weight. Now, the shortcomings of the energy balance model of obesity are several-fold. It doesn't account for the circadian clock system. It doesn't account for different phenotypes in our metabolism, meaning some people can over-excrete insulin. Some people have epigenetic factors. Some people have what's known as adaptive thermogenesis. And we're going to get into this Biggest Loser study. And what that means is essentially is you've undergone all these weight loss and weight gain cycles, because about 67% of overweight or obese people have tried various diets over the years. So they try a diet, they lose 5 or 10 pounds, they regain 10, 12, 15 pounds, then they lose more weight. And these vicious cycles happen. And what eventually happens through this cyclical dieting is your resting metabolic rate declines. And this was noted in the Biggest Loser study that we're going to talk about very shortly. And so that's where the energy balance model, I think, the major shortcomings of this. And then so you'll have individuals like Layne Norton and Spencer Lodowski say, well, of course, that's common. So what you need to do is then reverse diet. So if you're constantly counting calories, then you take the weekends off. And there's all these sort of, ways to circumvent this so-called adaptive thermogenesis and to overcome the suppression in your metabolic rate. And I think that gets complicated. And so that's why I lean more towards the carbohydrate insulin model of obesity. And one of the main pundits here is David Ludwig. And there's also Walter Willett and Gary Taubes and Jeff Volek. And there's all these other people that have been talking about the carbohydrate insulin model of obesity. And the basic premise of this model is centered around insulin and the fact that now there's hyperpalatable, ultra-processed, high glycemic index foods readily available. And so these high glycemic index foods, what they do is they increase the energy in your blood, or your glucose. That causes a compensatory hyperinsulinemic physiologic state. And that causes basically a dearth or a dramatic decrease in the amount of nutrients that are floating around in your bloodstream in the post-meal window, to the point where your blood energy goes down to lower levels than it was before the meal. And that causes you at your next meal to feel ravenously hungry and you overconsume energy. So the carbohydrate insulin model of obesity, it doesn't necessarily discount the fact that excessive energy intake is a problem. It certainly acknowledges and realizes that overconsumption of energy is a challenge, but it has a different mechanistic understanding into how the iteology of the problem of obesity arises, and that is centered around insulin. And so what you have going on here is you have two different research scientists, David Ludwig and Kevin Hall. They're constantly going back and forth. There's an editorial, there's a correction, there's a new study, and then there will be a secondary analysis by one party or the other, namely Kevin Hall. I think, with all due respect to him, I do read his papers, and I think he's a well-spoken researcher, but he and David Ludwig go head-to-head often. Now, what's unique about this paper by Ludwig et al. Is they actually provide Kevin's arguments and then eloquently sort of, refute them in a nice manner, which I think is a way to help move the conversation beyond who's right and who's wrong, and help us better learn from this and understand how we can help people lose weight. So that's why I would encourage you to read this paper. And like I said, I learned a lot about this, and this was namely this paragraph here on page 3 that I would like to read to you. And it has to do with the fact of this model of this cellular semi-starvation. And it has to do with the fact that when you're consuming hyperpalatable, high glycemic index foods, again, your glucose drives up, your insulin drives up, that causes resistance in your muscle tissue to the GLUT4 receptor. And there isn't the insulin resistance that I just referred to in the muscles. In the fat cells, they don't become insulin resistant, which is where I was going there. So what happens, and the fat cells start to accumulate a lot of this energy that would normally go to the muscles, but due to the fact that these foods are very high in their glycemic index and jack up glucose and insulin, so the fat cells start to undergo lipogenesis and store a lot of energy, and then essentially there's no more energy in the bloodstream, and then you get this counter-regulatory response, and they characterize this as cellular semi-starvation. So the brain perceives the signal as indicating, that in these critical tissues, they're deprived of energy. Again, because the muscle tissues are insulin resistant. If you eat these high glycemic index foods for a long period of time, and then what happens is there's a counter-regulatory hormone surge. And so what that means is the adrenaline, the noradrenaline, the cortisol increase because you have this sort of reactive hypoglycemia in the post-meal window due to the fact that you have insulin resistance in the muscle, but not in the fat tissue. Okay, so that's sort of the differences here. Now, I want to get into even some more nuances here and talk about different dietary phenotypes and so forth, but there's a few notes here that I want to get into that I think are important before we go there. In humans, drugs that increase insulin and insulin signaling cause fat gain of up to 5 pounds over the course of 2-month period. So again, this is more data to give credence to this notion that this carbohydrate insulin model of obesity is in fact something that we should all consider. Now, the problems, again, with the energy balance model of obesity is it considers all calories as metabolically equal, right? So a Snickers bar and an egg and an avocado are essentially the same if you believe in this model. Now, we know that not to be true. It's much easier to improve your health, insulin sensitivity, and microbiome health by eating things like whole, real food as opposed to processed food. So that, I think, is the major shortcoming of the energy balance model of obesity. And whereas both models agree that hyperpalatable ultra-processed foods lend themselves to overconsumption and alterations in the different hormones. So as we look here at what is regulating energy intake and energy expenditure? Well, on the energy intake side, there's various hormones. There's insulin, there's various hunger, satiety cues stemming from the brain. There's leptin, there's a hormone ghrelin, and there's just habits, right? You habitually eat certain foods at certain times and you crave these foods and so forth, these sort of intangible things that are very hard to break for people. So those are all things regulating energy intake that can be perturbed. For example, a few bad nights sleep can jack up leptin and cause individuals to feel more hungry than they normally are, and they actually crave more processed, hyperpalatable junk foods. And so on the other side of the energy balance spectrum, we have the energy expenditure. We have your resting metabolic rate. So we know that this is highly influenced by the amount of lean muscle mass you have. The more lean muscle mass you have, you bump up that RMR. Okay, so just sitting here at rest, if I'm now 187 some odd pounds, if I were 160 pounds and lost my muscle by maybe not exercising or being sedentary, my resting metabolic rate would be lower. So therefore, if I ate the same amount of foods, I would gain more weight at that lower body weight. Then you also have the thermic effect of food. So the process of eating in and of itself can raise energy expenditure. You have other behavioral issues like how much exercise do you do, how much walking do you do, how much non-exercise, thermogenesis, so gardening, walking your kid to school, all of that really matters. Okay. Now, here's a recent hypothesis paper from Kevin Hall. I think this is important. He just published this in May of this year. So the title of this, and this was published in the journal Science, Carbohydrates, Insulin, and Obesity. So Kevin goes on to say, we suggest that although insulin plays an important role in body fat regulation, the CIM model, the carbohydrate insulin model, fails because it focuses on the direct action of insulin on adipose tissue after the consumption of a meal containing carbohydrates, Rather, we propose that the role of insulin in obesity may be better understood by considering its pleiotropic action on multiple organs that is driven by factors mostly independent of carbohydrate intake. So it's interesting that in this paper, again, this is just an editorial published in the journal Science. It was peer-reviewed. They're acknowledging that insulin does impact body composition, that it does impact fat gain. And part of how this works, as they say, is it's pleiotropism, meaning if you hear the word multifactorial or pleiotropic, what this means is something has multiple actions, right? So insulin affects appetite, it affects fat cell signaling, it affects resting metabolic rate, it affects leptin. So insulin affects the brain as well. It does a lot of, it's pleiotropic. It's like the jack of all trades, right? It does a lot of different things. And so they're essentially acknowledging that insulin is a factor, which I think is interesting because up to now, to the best of my knowledge, Kevin Hall's stance has been that insulin is not independently linked with the fat gain and obesity, but it seems that maybe new evidence has caused him to sort of change his tune. Now, what's important here, and I was highlighting the study during the introduction, and this paper is titled Persistent Metabolic Adaptations 6 Years After the Biggest Loser Competition. So just very soon, we're going to talk about how a continual weight loss and weight gain and weight loss and weight gain, how that affects your resting metabolic rate and what happens many, many years after individuals lose weight, what happens to their resting metabolic rate. But first, I want to welcome you all back. It's Mike Mutzel. I'm grateful that you're here. Thank you for subscribing. Thank you for hitting that like button and telling the algorithm that this video was helpful for you. And if you're in iTunes, you can leave us some feedback. That really goes a long way. And I want to let you know that this show is brought to you by our sister company, Myoscience Nutrition. So what's unique, friends, is there's a new electrolyte packet that we've worked on for a very long time. We're bringing out to you that features a multi-ingredient combination of both creatine, electrolytes featuring red real salt, potassium, magnesium. You have the electrolyte taurine. You have a little bit of calcium, all paired in a easy to drink stick pack that you can mix with water. You can bring it, for example, on the road with you. You can bring it to the gym with you. You can bring it hiking, wherever you want. Now, what's unique about this multi-ingredient combination formula is the blend of the creatine and the electrolytes and salt from Redmond Real Salt has never been commercially actually available up to now, up until we launched this, because it's only been studied in research circles. Various universities throughout the world have studied the combination of creatine paired with electrolytes and found greater sports performance and also supporting the healthy hydration response. So if you're into exercise, if you're into intermittent fasting or a low-carb ketogenic style diet, you can hop on over to myoscience.com and check out the new electrolyte sticks where you can buy one, get the second box free now until the 20th of October. So again, you can buy one, get the second box completely free. They're shipping the first week of November. So definitely check that out and support your body's healthy hydration response and sports performance. So as we continue on, I wanted to share a little bit more details here about this persistent metabolic adaptation. And this was a 6-year follow-up study from The Biggest Loser. Many of you remember this TV series where Jillian Michaels and other trainers just real hard on people, having them do a lot of these strenuous workouts and trying to, whoever lost the most weight quickly, won the sort of challenge and so on. But what was interesting is that was just a 30-week period, I believe. And they measured their body weight. And then 6 years later, what you saw here is a lot of these individuals had a suppression in their metabolic rate, yet they continued to gain weight after the TV series ended. So if you just sort of think about two different scenarios, you have person one who lost weight slowly, improved their health and their exercise and all that. You have person two, Sally, let's just say, Sally lost a lot of weight quickly and then started to regain it. Her resting metabolic rate is now lower, even though she's at the same body weight as when she started, compared to Bill, let's just say, or Frank, who lost weight slowly over a period of time and slowly improved their health and maybe didn't lose significant amount of weight. So that's the challenge here, friends, is if we only focus on calories and energy balance and myopically focused on weight, as opposed to health and other proxies like fitness and power and so forth, heart rate variability, for example, it's hard to completely sustain that over the long haul because what happens is your metabolism adapts here. And so it's sort of hard to overcome that. And there's different strategies: reverse dieting, taking the weekends off. There's carb backloading. There's all these sort of more sort of sophisticated ways to surmount and overcome this metabolic adaptation. But this happens in a lot of people. Now, that's again why I think it's important to understand both models. The calorie counting model clearly can work for some people, The people that we see that working in most often is young fitness competitors and bodybuilders, right? So they're training very intensely. They're doing a lot of resistance training paired with cardio. But when they stop doing that, what's often happens is they tend to increase their fat mass. And so, that's where this carbohydrate insulin model of obesity and focusing on, all the different pleiotropic factors, circadian rhythms, hormone changes, sleep-wake cycles, the microbiome, there's a lot of different factors here that we're going to get into and talk about the nuances here. So as you can see on the diagram, here's sort of how this goes. Now, I think it's important to understand these details so that when you're talking with people and they say, oh my gosh, you believe in a low carb diet, there's no science to support that. There's no mechanisms. I think this image is really interesting because as you can see here, as we go down this, you have a high glycemic load diet. So if we think about this, this would be anything white and processed. So you have white flour, white bread, donuts, pizza, cookies, chips, crackers, sugar, right? So what does that do? That increases levels of glucose in the blood, and that causes alterations in the gut hormones, and that causes alterations in insulin to glucagon ratio. This is really important because, as we've talked about with Ben Bickman and other experts over the years, it's really important in order to sort of oxidize fat and get into a fat-burning physiologic state. We need three things to really happen. We need low glucose, we need low insulin, and we need to raise glucagon. And that ratio, not only does it help to unlock the stored fat in our fat cells in the adipose tissue, but that increases the liver's synthesis of ketones and helps our white fat behave more like brown fat, known as beige fat, so we can increase our resting metabolic rate that way, improving insulin sensitivity and much more. So as we continue on here, if you're eating a high glycemic load diet, the alteration in the glucose and insulin and glucagon ratio promote fat storage, prevent fat oxidation, and that causes this vicious cycle of increased energy intake and reduced energy expenditure, right? A lot of people know they should go to the gym after work. They know they should go walking. They know they should go hiking, but what do they often say? Often they say they don't have time or they don't have the energy to do so. Now, why wouldn't they have the energy? Well, it turns out that when we're constantly sort of having these ebbs and flows and glycemic variability and insulin resistance and leptin resistance and so on, that creates this situation where there's less energy in the bloodstream. And we sort of talked about this earlier, this cellular semi-starvation. And this is a tenet of the carbohydrate insulin model of obesity that I think is important to remember. Again, high glycemic processed foods jack up glucose, jack up insulin, and then in the post-meal window, you get, blood energy is lower than it was before, so you feel lethargic, you feel tired. This is why people are like, oh my gosh, I'm so hungry. Even though I just had a 1,200 calorie meal of processed chicken nuggets and junk food and whatever, they feel ravenously hungry. Part of that is because of this so-called cellular semi-starvation due to insulin resistance and hyperinsulinemia. And that's explained in this diagram. So I think that's an important thing to sort of consider. And we've all been there before. Maybe we've been traveling, we went out and had food we know we shouldn't have. And then a few hours later, you're like even more hungry and hangry and stressed out. Whereas if you maybe have a breakfast of like whole eggs, not avocado, maybe a little bacon, you can almost go all day without eating. You're like, oh my gosh, it's like 4 o'clock. I haven't even had anything since 10 o'clock in the morning. So that, because there's not this ebb and flow in glycemic variability and insulin, you do feel more satiated. You don't feel this ravenous and all these counter-regulatory hormones increasing. So I think that's really important. So that's essentially where these models differ. Now, what I would like to focus on as we continue on here is talk about why focusing on weight is not necessarily the best thing, because it doesn't totally change your risks for health factors and complications and all-cause mortality and even death. And so with this article, and the title of this is Obesity Treatment, Weight Loss versus Increasing Fitness and Physical Activity for Reducing Health Risks. And so you can see here on this diagram, obesity treatment that focuses on weight-centered approaches, like you got to diet, you got to lose weight, you got to lose fat. Essentially, that just creates this vicious cycle of weight regain and doesn't lead to lasting health improvements. It doesn't lead to lasting cardio-respiratory improvements or increased levels of muscle mass or changes in a favorable manner when it comes to overall health risk. Whereas focusing more on improving your cardio-respiratory fitness, improving strength, improving muscle mass, improving sleep quality, improving heart rate variability lead to sustainable changes independent of weight loss in health risk factors. And so there was this really interesting chart here that I think is phenomenal, where they talk about They look at all-cause mortality in normal weight individuals, obese individuals, and overweight individuals. And what you see here is physically fit individuals, irrespective of whether or not they're obese or normal weight, have a significant reduction in all-cause mortality compared to unfit individuals who are of the same body weight category, whether that's a BMI that's obese or overweight. So it's much better to focus on, getting fit and getting healthier as opposed to just focusing on what the scale says. Because if you just focus on the scale, I can tell you how to lose weight quickly. Basically, you starve yourself. You go and ride on the elliptical, you sweat out, you can get dehydrated. I did this actually for a powerlifting competition a few years ago, and I felt weak and absolutely terrible, but I was able to lose 8 pounds. So to change the scale to get into a lower, powerlifting category, I did a lot of unhealthy things. Now, if I was just focusing on the scale, thinking that the scale was a reflection of my health, I would have felt good about that. And you can do this vicious cycle where you constantly do that, you regain the weight and you do it again, and pretty soon your resting metabolic rate is lower than it was when you started. And you wonder why you cannot continue to lose weight. So shifting sort of the goal and the focus from the scale needs to be a certain number to, okay, how do I feel just objectively when I walk up the stairs? How is my energy? How much weight can I move? Can I do sprints? Can I go on a hike without, feeling like I'm going to have a heart attack and my heart's going to pound out of my chest? So there's different parameters here. And also weightlifting, what I like about that is the data is coming around showing that weightlifting and interval training are better ways to not only reduce all-cause mortality and risk of death, even risk for severe COVID, for example, but as ways to help with fat loss and improve cardio-respiratory fitness. So here's a paper right here. It was in the Annals of Epidemiology. Cardioprotective effects of resistance training add to those of total activity in Americans. So resistance training is as good as just overall movement in general. So this was a great paper, and it seems like the research is sort of catching up with what we knew to be true anecdotally with regards to resistance training. So definitely check out Sal DiStefano's book, The Resistance Training Revolution. We did a podcast with him, and that's phenomenal. Now, I want to finish off here on dieting and why focusing on dieting, may not be the best thing. And so this was an article from 2018 from the CDC, actually, attempts to lose weight among American adults in 2013 through 2016. Now, what they found is that about 50% of all adults had tried dieting at some point in their life. And we know that to be true. People are always looking for the latest diet, the paleo diet, the South Beach diet, the keto diet, intermittent fasting diet, whatever the diet is. A lot of people have tried this. It seems that much higher percentage of women have tried various diets compared to men. And it seems that a lot of individuals that are overweight have tried various diets. And about 67% of obese and overweight individuals have tried various diets. Now, the thing that we know here with these numbers is more and more overweight people are becoming obese, and more obese individuals are becoming morbidly obese. So again, it goes back to what I was just saying about focusing and reframing on health as opposed to just dieting and losing weight. It's more sustainable when you focus on health. And I just have a small story here that I want to share with you. This lady, I'll just say her name is Dee. That's not her full name or real name, but she sent me a message, and we were texting actually. She follows me on Instagram. She recently got COVID and was wondering about, hey, are my antibody levels sufficiently protective enough to maybe prevent future COVID or end up in the hospital? Now, she was an overweight woman, really nice lady, but she exercised a lot, and she has been exercising and has been slowly sort of improving her health over the years, eating better and losing more and more weight. She was like really overweight before. Now she's, just sort of in the overweight category. Her antibody levels were close to 1,000, which is, essentially what most individuals get after they get immunized. So her antibody levels were off the chart. She didn't even know she got sick, but she was exposed to COVID and had a massive increase in her antibody levels. And I thought that was really pretty fascinating because she's a woman of color, she's in her 40s, and she's overweight. And just by focusing on health, she was able to avert going to the hospital, having severe COVID, and had sufficient antibody levels higher than a lot of people that I know that are of normal weight, but kind of live unhealthy lives. So I have a lot of people that I've known that have had COVID, had antibodies. They were in the 300 range. Again, hers were close to 1,000. So that was the semi-quantitative IgG antibodies to the spike protein. So I thought that was interesting that, by focusing on fitness, she improved her body's immune response and reduced, obviously going to the hospital or having severe disease and long haul and all that. So that was interesting. But as we finish off here on this image, what a lot of people tend to do when they want to lose weight, about 63% of people focus on exercise and the same amount focus on just eating less, okay? Now, the challenge here about just eating less is, guess what happens? You cause this adaptive thermogenesis. So instead of just eating less, maybe you shorten your feeding window and you practice time-restricted feeding as opposed to just totally cutting calories. Because when you start to just totally cut calories, your body resists that by what? Slowing down your resting metabolic rate, slowing down cortisol release and noradrenaline and your overall energy expenditure and volitional exercise, okay? So instead of just eating less, you could eat higher quality foods. And again, this is where the energy balance model fails because it doesn't totally focus on, in terms of a strategy about how to eat better. If we're just focused on calories, we can look at unhealthy but low calorie foods and think that we're improving our health by consuming those. Whereas if we focus a little bit more on, hey, what is the post-meal impact of these foods on my metabolic regulatory hormones like insulin, like glucagon, like blood glucose? What are these foods going to do to my microbiome? I think the carbohydrate insulin model of obesity provides a little bit more of a tangible way to approach dietary strategies and food quality. What the survey found from the CDC also is that a lot of people focus on exercise as a way to lose weight. About 63% of people in this survey of hundreds of people find, when they want to lose weight, they focus on exercise. Well, what does that exercise usually entail for these people? Steady state cardio. A lot of people, they go to the gym, they hop on the elliptical or treadmill, and they focus on burning calories. Again, what that ultimately does, friends, is cause you to be more hungry in the post-exercise window. If you just focus on burning calories on the treadmill, you go do a really hard workout and you're just getting your heart rate up and all of that, that's not sustainable. That's not a really targeted approach based on power, on wattage. We did a review on the Carol bike that focuses on, through their algorithm, customizing power, which is an objective marker of the amount of effort that you're putting in, and optimizes that so you're progressively improving your fitness and your strength. So just going to the gym and just doing, I'm doing cardio, all you're doing is essentially getting yourself to be more hungry in the post-exercise window. And I see this all the time in the sports and conditioning space where people are training for a marathon or a half marathon. And eventually when that's over and they stop training because they've increased their appetite because they're exercising more, they continue to gain weight. So that's not really a good strategy. Instead, focusing on strength, objective markers using things like power and all of that is a much more sustainable way to do that. And lastly, a lot of people are drinking a lot of water to try to lose weight. People, they say they're eating less junk food. Only 42% are eating less junk or fast food. Some people say still 30% of people surveyed here say they're eating less fat, which I thought was interesting. So, as we sort of finish off here, I think, one of the more sustainable strategies is a combination of a low carb diet, time restricted feeding, paired with resistance training. Now, of course, there's different nuances. There's different ways to sort of personalize this based upon people's unique health goals and things like that. But it seems that a more sustainable way to go about this is not this crash diet, totally cutting out meals, being more slow and steady here, causing these adaptations, not causing all these surges and counter-regulatory hormones and the cellular semi-starvation, being a little bit more consistent, and then building up that base of your resting metabolic rate with resistance training. And so again, your skeletal muscle mass contributes immensely to your overall resting metabolic rate and your energy expenditure. And the more skeletal muscle you have, the more leptin receptors and insulin receptors you have. So therefore, you can have better control over these different hormones and much more. So that's sort of my bias here. But I would like you to read this paper and let me know what you think. Again, the title of this paper that we've been diving into is A Carbohydrate Insulin Model, a Physiologic Perspective on the Obesity Pandemic. And what I like about this, friends, again, is it's more objective. They outline both models, conflicting models, the carbohydrate insulin model of obesity with the energy balance model, talk about pros and cons of each, the physiologic mechanisms driving obesity in both of these different models, and the shortcomings and limitations, and also the arguments of the other side, which is actually pretty cool to see that. So definitely check it out. I would love to know what's worked for you. Again, where I come from is after having clients who have done the dieting, they've done the calorie counting, they've done the treadmill, the elliptical, and it hasn't worked, focusing on actually less exercise, but more targeted approach, strength training with a little walking, time restricted feeding, low carb diet tends to work and be more sustainable over the long haul when it comes to focusing on improving health, as opposed to just myopically honing in on weight loss, because it's a futile cycle. You lose some weight, you regain it, you lose some weight, you regain it. And in doing so, you don't totally improve your health. So that's it for today, friends. I'm grateful that you're tuning in all the way through the end. I think you might enjoy those show notes and some of these images. If you haven't been watching on YouTube, definitely check it out. I'll link all those in the show notes below, and we will catch you on a future video down the road. Appreciate you all.